The gunshot came without warning. It tore through the upper floor of the penthouse at 2:47 in the morning, shattering glass that had never known anything but the cold reflection of Seoul's skyline. Security monitors flickered. Guards who had stood at their posts for 3 years straight turned and ran without a word, their loyalty dissolving like smoke the moment they understood what that sound meant. Not an assassination attempt. A signal. The signal that the king had finally fallen. Park Joon-seo sat alone in the center of the room, bleeding from a wound on his left shoulder, his white shirt soaked dark at the collar. Around him lay the wreckage of an empire. Overturned furniture, shattered phones, contracts scattered across the floor that had once represented millions in revenue and years of careful negotiation. The most feared man in Seoul did not reach for a weapon. He did not call for backup. He simply sat there, staring at nothing, while the city he had ruled for a decade continued to glow indifferently beyond the broken window. And somewhere in the wreckage of his mind, one face rose above all the noise. Not the face of the rival who had betrayed him, not the face of the Mafia heiress he had married for political advantage, but the face of the woman he had chosen to abandon, the woman who, without him ever truly understanding it, had been the reason none of this had happened sooner. Her name was Amara. And this is where the story really begins. 7 years before that night, Park Joon-seo was not yet a king. He was rising, sharp, dangerous, and deeply feared within the Cheongpa Syndicate, one of Seoul's oldest and most violent criminal organizations. He had clawed his way up, not through inheritance or connection, but through sheer cold ruthlessness, executing orders that senior lieutenants refused, absorbing punishment without complaint, and building a reputation that made men lower their eyes when he walked into a room. He was 29 years old, earning his first real power, and completely hollow beneath all of it. Nobody talked about the loneliness. Criminal organizations understood fear. They understood loyalty purchased with money and threat. But nobody in the syndicate ever spoke about the particular exhaustion that came from living inside violence every single day. From never sleeping without one eye open, from never trusting a single conversation, from never once sitting across from another human being without calculating whether they wanted something from you. Joon-seo had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without armor. He was in Nairobi on a logistics assignment, money being moved through shell companies, alliances being confirmed with East African distribution networks, when he first saw her. Amara was working at an international aid coordination office 2 floors below the building where his meeting had taken place. He had taken a wrong turn in the elevator and ended up in her corridor, and she had looked up from her desk with the calm, unhurried eyes of someone who had absolutely nothing to fear from him. "Amara, you look lost," she said simply, not as a joke, but as a genuine observation. The way a person speaks when they are actually trying to help. He did not know what to say. In his world, nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody looked at him without first calculating risk. But she had not seen the syndicate lieutenant. She had seen a man standing confused in a hallway, and she had offered him directions. It was such a small thing. It undid something in him completely. They spoke for 11 minutes that first afternoon. He told her nothing real about himself. She asked nothing probing. But when he walked back to his meeting, something had shifted in the air around him. Something he could not name and did not try to. He extended his stay in Nairobi by 4 days, then 8. By the end of 3 weeks, he had stopped pretending the business required his presence. Amara was a woman of uncommon steadiness. She had grown up moving between countries with her diplomat father, which had given her both fluency in navigating unfamiliar environments and an almost preternatural ability to read people without them realizing it. She saw through Joon-seo's silence in ways that should have frightened her, but somehow did not. She did not push. She did not pry. She simply remained, present, warm, entirely herself, and let him choose how much of himself to bring to the table. He brought more than he intended. Every night that week, over quiet meals in unremarkable restaurants where no one knew either of their names, he found himself talking. Not about business, not about power, but about small things. The neighborhood he grew up in, the smell of rain on concrete in July, the way his grandmother used to hum while she cooked. Things he had not thought about in years because thinking about softness when you lived inside violence felt like a liability. "You carry a lot," she told him one evening, watching him over her tea. "Not the kind you put down at the door, the kind that lives inside you." Joon-seo. He was quiet for a long moment. "Does it show that much, Amara?" "Only to people who are looking," she said. She wasn't trying to save him. She was simply the first person in years who had looked. That was the thing that broke him open. Not grand romance, not dramatic declaration, but the quiet act of being truly seen. When he returned to Seoul, he brought her with him. And within 18 months, they were married in a ceremony so understated that half the syndicate didn't hear about it until it was done. Joon-seo had not asked permission. He had simply decided, and for the first time in his life, the decision had nothing to do with strategy. The empire came after her, not before. Joon-seo's rise to the position of boss accelerated in the years that followed his marriage with a speed that even his closest captains struggled to fully explain. Yes, he was sharper than his predecessor. Yes, he was more disciplined. But there was something else. A stability in his leadership that had not existed before. A quality that made even his most volatile underbosses willing to follow his direction without the usual internal friction that plagued syndicate transitions. What none of them could see was where that stability actually originated. Amara moved through the world of the syndicate the way water moves through stone, not with force, but with quiet, consistent presence. She never attended meetings. She never issued orders. She never once presented herself as anything other than the boss's wife. But men came to her. Captains who were on the edge of open conflict would somehow find themselves sharing a meal at their home, and by the end of the evening, the tension had eased in ways that no threat or bribe could have achieved. She had a gift for hearing what people were actually saying beneath what they claimed to want, and for reflecting it back to them in language that diffused rather than escalated. There were at least 3 territorial disputes that should have ended in bloodshed, in police investigations, in the kind of public violence that brings government pressure down on entire organizations. They did not, because Amara had quietly intervened at the exact right moment, said exactly the right thing to exactly the right person, and redirected the anger before it reached ignition point. Nobody ordered her to do this. Nobody even knew she was doing it, not fully. She simply understood that her husband's stability was built on a foundation of human relationships, and she tended those relationships the way a gardener tends soil, invisibly, patiently, with deep understanding of what each thing needed to grow. The empire expanded. Men feared Joon-seo, but they trusted Amara. And in the underground world he operated in, where fear is the currency of power and trust is the rarest commodity of all, this made her worth more than any alliance or territory he had ever acquired. He did not know this yet. He would not know it until it was too late to matter. The pressure began in the 3rd year of his reign as boss, arriving not in the form of an attack, but in the form of whispers. Elders of the syndicate, men who had watched Korean criminal dynasties rise and fall across 4 decades, began making observations at the edges of formal meetings. A foreign wife was an unpredictable variable. Blood alliances mattered. Marriages between syndicate families that bound territories and cemented loyalties in ways that mutual interest alone never could. The Shin family in Busan had a daughter. The Lim network in Incheon was looking to expand northward. A strategic marriage could double Joon-seo's territorial reach overnight. He dismissed the first conversations. He was colder about the second. But the third arrived alongside a genuine crisis, a rival. Organization pushing hard at his eastern border, political protection growing expensive, and three of his most important captains quietly expressing uncertainty about the future of the Syndicate. The elders framed the marriage question inside all of it, packaging it as the logical solution to a logistical problem and something in Joon-seo, something that had been sleeping quietly under years of Amara's steadying presence, began to stir awake. Pride. The old, cold kind. The kind that had made him dangerous before he knew what peace felt like. He began to change slowly, the way seasons change, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. He became distant at home, shorter in conversation. He stopped sharing meals with her in the evenings and started taking calls he used to take after she was asleep. He stopped asking her opinion on decisions she had always helped him think through. And when she offered perspective anyway, he received it with the polite, flat acknowledgement of a man who has already made up his mind. Amara. Something has changed, she said to him one night quietly, without accusation. The same tone she had always used, the one that saw rather than attacked. Talk to me, Joon-seo. Joon-seo. Nothing has changed, he said. I'm managing the business. That's what I do. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not push. She never pushed. But she knew. The way she had always known. Not through surveillance or argument, but through the deep cellular intelligence of a woman who had spent years reading the atmosphere of a room that most people could not even see. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in March. No argument, no confrontation. He sat across from her at the table where they had eaten 1,000 quiet meals and told her, in the careful, controlled language of a man who has rehearsed the conversation many times, that he intended to dissolve the marriage, that the Syndicate's future required a different kind of alliance, that he hoped she understood this was not personal. She sat very still. The morning light came through the kitchen window the same way it always did. Outside, Seoul moved through its ordinary rhythms, indifferent to the collapse happening at this table. Amara. She was quiet for so long that he began to feel the silence as a physical weight. Then she looked at him, not with anger, not with tears, but with the clear, steady gaze of someone who has just understood something completely. Amara. Power without peace always destroys itself, she said, soft, simple, the way she said everything that mattered. She did not beg. She did not bargain. She rose from the table, walked to the bedroom, and began to pack with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to everything in her life. By afternoon, she was gone. She left no letter. She left no anger in the air. She simply left. And the absence she created was so total, so complete, that Joon-seo stood in the doorway of the room they had shared for 6 years and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of silence that is not peace, but void. He told himself it would pass. He told himself the business required this. He told himself that a man in his position could not afford the luxury of sentiment. The wedding to Min Ji-shin took place 6 weeks later. It was lavish in the way that Syndicate celebrations always are, expensive beyond reason, attended by powerful men who smiled with their mouths and watched with their eyes, dripping with the particular kind of ceremony that is less about joy and more about the public demonstration of a new order. The media that covered such things praised the alliance. The underworld celebrated the merger of 2 major territories. Joon-seo stood at the center of it all and looked like exactly what he was supposed to look like: powerful, decisive, in control. The first sign that something was wrong came not with violence, but with silence of a different kind. Within 6 weeks of the marriage, 2 separate negotiations that had been moving steadily toward completion simply stopped. Counterparts who had been responsive for months suddenly became difficult to reach. Calls went unreturned. Meetings were rescheduled, then canceled. Joon-seo's captains brought him the reports with carefully neutral faces, and he read them and told himself it was normal adjustment. New alliance, new dynamics, old frictions sorting themselves out. Then a captain named Beck, who had run the northern operations with absolute loyalty for 4 years, requested a meeting and did not show up to it. This was not normal. Beck was the kind of man who showed up to meetings the way the sun showed up each morning, without exception, without excuse. His absence meant something, and what it meant was not logistical. Min-ji Shin, his new wife, brought to the marriage the aggressive energy of a woman raised inside syndicate politics, which meant she understood expansion, but had never learned the quieter disciplines of consolidation. Where Amara had counseled restraint, Min-ji counseled acceleration. Push into the rival territory now, while the new alliance still has its shock value. Eliminate the eastern faction before they find new backers. Move faster than the enemy can think. Joon-seo, perhaps because the aggression matched the mood he was trying to inhabit, began to listen. Operations escalated. Violence that had been carefully managed at a level below public attention began to creep above it. Police, who had been quietly managed through a combination of bribes and the invisible diplomatic buffer Amara had maintained with certain connected families, began to apply pressure in ways that suggested the buffer was gone. Because it was. She was gone. And the architecture she had maintained, the invisible web of relationships and managed tensions and quietly brokered pieces, had begun to collapse the moment she walked out of that apartment. The truth arrived in pieces, each one more devastating than the last. It was a captain named Oh who brought him the first piece, a man who had been with the Syndicate for 15 years and whose loyalty Joon-seo had never once had reason to question. Oh came to him privately, in the kind of meeting that takes place without security in the room, and laid out what he had learned. There had been, in the years of Amara's presence, a series of quiet conversations between her and representatives of 3 rival organizations, conversations that Joon-seo had never known about, never authorized, and never understood the necessity of. She had been maintaining back-channel relationships with people who, by the official logic of the underworld, should have been enemies. She had been the reason those enemies had never truly committed to hostility. There had been a planned assassination 2 years ago, originating from the Lim network in Incheon, that had been quietly dismantled, not through force or counterintelligence, but because Amara had spoken to someone's mother, a woman who attended the same international community church. A quiet conversation over tea that had somehow reached the right ear and caused a decision to be reversed. There were peace treaties that existed only as shared understandings between Amara and people in 3 different criminal organizations, understandings that had no paperwork, no formal recognition, and no mechanism for survival after she left. Captain O looked at his boss across the table and said what neither of them wanted to say out loud. "Oh, boss. Half the reason we never went to war in 6 years was because of her. The men who stayed loyal. Some of them were loyal to you, but some of them were loyal to what she represented. And she's gone." Joon-seo sat with this for a very long time. Outside his office window, Seoul continued its indifferent motion. Somewhere in the city, things were already in motion that could not be stopped. He understood this the way a man understands something that his body already knew before his mind caught up, with a cold, sinking recognition that had no remedy. The collapse, when it came simultaneously from every direction. A betrayal inside the inner syndicate. Two captains who had been quietly negotiating with the rival Eastern faction for months, held in place only by relationships that no longer existed. A financial seizure initiated by a government investigator who had, until 6 weeks ago, been kept at arm's length by a connection Amara had maintained through a mutual contact, neither of whom Joon-seo even knew. The Lim network moving on the northern border no longer held back by whatever understanding had existed between them and the woman who was no longer present to maintain it. The assassination attempt on the penthouse was not the beginning of the end. It was the end of the end. And when it was done, and Joon-seo sat bleeding in the wreckage of the empire he had believed he built, Minji Shin was already in a car heading to her family's compound in Busan. The alliance marriage had been strategic from her side. There had been no warmth in it, no loyalty, no stake. She had married power. And when power ended, she left. He found Amara 3 weeks later. It took significant effort. She had not hidden herself exactly, but she had moved into a life so different from the one they had shared that locating her felt like searching across a border into a different world. She was in Accra now, working with an international network that helped people displaced by organized violence rebuild stable lives. She had built something in the months since she left. Something quiet, something grounded, something that did not require fear to sustain itself. When he arrived at the building where she worked, the people inside moved around her with the ease of people who trusted their foundation completely. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look hurt. She looked, if anything, simply present. The same quality she had always carried. The one he had somehow failed to understand was not just her personality, but her philosophy. They walked outside together into a street that smelled of rain-cooled dust and open air. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. She looked the same, or perhaps lighter. He could not tell which. Joon-seo. "Why didn't you fight for us?" he asked. The question came out differently than he had planned it, smaller, quieter, stripped of whatever defensive architecture he had built around it. She looked at him for a moment, the way she had always looked at him, not measuring, not judging, but simply seeing. Amara. "Love should never have to compete with pride," she said softly. And then she turned and walked back inside, back to the work she had built and the people she was helping, back to a life that did not require anyone's permission or protection to stand. He stood on that street for a long time after she disappeared through the door. The city moved around him, ordinary, alive, indifferent to the ruins he had made. He had ruled through fear for a decade. He had expanded territory, crushed rivals, accumulated power in every form the underworld recognized. And he had lost all of it, not because his enemies were stronger, not because his strategies were wrong, but because he had looked at the foundation of everything he had built and decided it was expendable. He had called it strategy. She had called it what it was. And the empire, in the end, had agreed with her.